living beings, not just human beings, communicate in some way, and perhaps not only living beings do so. But let's just look at the communication between living beings. We consider communication to be any behavior that systematically triggers a corresponding reaction to an action. All it takes is a gesture, a sound. Any signal produces a closely related reaction on the part of the person who perceives the signal. Communication is needed to survive because in the face of a certain event, the signal is sent that allows the community to react accordingly and benefit from it. The preservation of the group, of society, needs communication signals to share experiences and overcome difficulties as a group. Unity is strength. Communication requires a specific signal for each type of event, if you want to be more precise in signaling. A shout to signal danger is less effective than a more specific signal indicating a specific danger. Because in this way you can trigger a specific defense reaction, much more effective than simply fleeing in all directions not knowing what has happened. Therefore, with progress, man has gradually moved from using generic sounds to sounds that are more and more specific, more complex in form. It is intuitive to imagine how over thousands of years we have gone from generic sounds to words with a very specific meaning. We also note that by its nature, this kind of evolution in sound communication cannot be universally unambiguous. It differs from area to area in relation to contacts between individuals in individual communities. Therefore, inevitably, many different languages have emerged, many ways of communicating and expressing themselves, with a direct effect on the behavior of geographically distant societies, unable to communicate and understand each other. Within a certain circle of people able to communicate and understand each other, what we call culture, civilization, tradition, ethnicity is born. Ways of speaking, of thinking, of reasoning, of eating, of celebrating, of living, which are a reason for security, peace, quiet, serenity are all in common. All this pushes societies to a protection, a form of closure towards those who are strangers, whose behaviors are not immediately understandable, for the need to protect their own tranquility in the first place. This does not take away the interest in the outsider, but this openness requires a certain amount of time for a series of compromises, where the cultures do not coincide and are too different. The evolution of communication in humans is born, as we have said, in the form of simple sounds, then they become more specific sounds that we will call phonetic units. Each group has its own, more and more complex sounds are then formed to diversify the information, and we can begin to identify them as words, plus elementary sounds combined together to form a more complex sound. Thousands of years pass from one phase to the next. We then move on to sentences, a set of words to describe no longer an entire concept with a single sound, but to describe the entire concept in greater detail. It is important to note that in this regard the sentences, the set of words, follow a very precise and this time universal construct. Any sentence necessarily contains a subject, an action, and an object. Action is identified by words that we will call verbs, and any sentence, in any language of the earth, contains a subject, a verb, and an object. You can change the order. Subject, verb, object. Or subject, object, verb. Some languages may have sentences without the subject or without the object, but only because in the jargon the missing elements are implied, proving that it is not possible to formulate sentences of complete meaning without the combination of these three fundamental elements, and all this has universal value. All this has a logical explanation linked to the fact that the sentences express our experiences which are only of the type, action of a subject towards an object. All the reality we perceive has this characteristic, without exception. An action of a subject towards an object. Any sentence in any language expresses just that. It is interesting and curious to observe the analogy that exists between any sentence, composed in any language of the world of subject, action or verb and object, and any software instruction, also formed by the action or command to be executed, subject or input parameters and object, i.e. where to deposit the result. This is the case with the machine language of any computer. Whatever the programming language, we always have a verb, a subject, i.e. the input, and an object, i.e. the output. Let's look at some examples. the functions. A complex set of instructions that can be invoked through a name, the name of the function. The name of the function is practically equivalent to the verb, which corresponds to an action that is also very complex, and the form of writing is the one we see. The result, which is being processed, is equal to what the function will produce starting from the input formed by one or more parameters, those listed in parentheses. Or the call. That is, the call to a routine or subprogram, which we equate to the verb of a sentence, corresponding to an action. In this case, subject, i.e. input, and object, i.e. output are given in a certain order in parentheses. And again, the most modern form of so-called object-oriented programming. Imagine an object as a container for a series of actions, each of which has a specific elaboration. The single action is called a method, so the notation becomes XY object, point, ZX method, and in parentheses the input and output. To express anything, be it an experience, a sensation, a feeling, a thought, a description, we need to refer to three elements: subject, verb, object. And this also applies to computer instructions. Whatever coding or language we use, it is not an arbitrary choice or a pre-established standard, it is a logical consequence of the reality that surrounds us and whose effects we can perceive. We are basically passive in perceiving reality. We only ever gain experience in the form of subject, action, and object. Before the invention of writing, human beings handed down their culture, their knowledge through verbal communication, which became a powerful tool for preserving their traditions from generation to generation. The invention of writing can be considered one of humanity's greatest achievements. The systems of representation of language through graphic signs have evolved between different civilizations, following fairly common paths and then often arriving at the definition of an alphabet. Writing has gone through precise evolutionary steps, from the initial phase in which signs first represented objects and then concepts, to the next phase in which signs were associated with individual sounds and were used to transcribe speech. The birth of writing took place within the greatest civilizations of the world, such as in the Middle East and Egypt in 3500 to 3200 BC, in China from 1200 BC and in pre-Columbian America in 600 BC, following roughly the same evolutionary stages. These complex writing systems were developed by farmers who had settled in the rich alluvial valleys crossed by large rivers and which required the invention of recording systems to manage administrative complexity. We have seen how our experiences are all synthesized according to the formula subject, action, object. We use this form in writing, but even in computer programming, because it is the essence of how we are able to perceive reality and how our thinking is formed. As far as our mind is concerned, we memorize these experiences by connecting them with others we have, thanks to the analogies we can find. In the case of experiences that have no analogy with any other experience we have acquired, we are perplexed, disoriented, because we are unable to classify them, to put them on the shelves of our minds. We will include it as uncertain, suspicious information, with the risk of misleading us to our disadvantage. If someone then explains them to us, that is, provides us with the whole series of subject, action, object and logical, consequential connections, which, starting from the information in our possession, lead us step by step to the conclusion, to the object of the last experience, this can finally be correctly classified on the shelves of our mind and we feel calmer and more satisfied. But a less demanding form for our brain and decidedly leaner and faster is to classify information, subject, action, object without worrying about analogies, consequential logic, blindly trusting the source from which we have news. It is, of course, everything that we do not have direct experience of, but is fed to us by others. If the source is a trusted person, such as family, instructors, this is in fact the only way to increase one's own experience by exploiting the experiences of others. It is also the most natural and primordial method by which various animal species have evolved and managed to survive. But resting too much or exclusively on this form of learning based only on the trust placed in those who provide us with information presents the enormous risk of being manipulated by those who want us to believe what is most convenient for them, to control us, to have us at their service. Therefore, curiosity, which is synonymous with the search for the wise, with the desire to always verify the logic of reasoning, is a mental effort that we can never give up. It is tiring, but it is the only guarantee for our freedom of thought. There are some techniques that it is good to make our own to be able to more easily understand when a piece of news is true and when it is not. Fake news is not necessarily so-called fake news, understood as fake news put out with the sole intent of deceiving others. Fake news is much more widespread than fake news because it is a consequence of our natural tendency to carry out our activities with as little effort as possible. In doing so, many oversights are committed, many approximations, with a lot of superficiality, which added all together lead to distorting the original news which, while remaining true in substance, ends up taking on nuances and meanings. Even opposites, without anyone having the explicit intention of misinforming, of spreading falsehoods. This is not fake news but information that is substantially true but still ends up leading to wrong conclusions. The underlying reason lies in the fact that communication takes place in the form of subject, action, object, which has the limit of not being able to describe all the complexity of the real world. With only 3 terms, a set of boundary aspects are necessarily taken for granted, obviously, while the information is all in the action involving subject and object. That is the news, the whole context in which it takes place is understood. And this is where the misunderstanding arises. Because if we are not analytical, if we do not know how to verify the action in the context in which it took place and evaluate whether the conclusion is credible, correct, we risk taking everything at face value, so much so that if others say so it will certainly be true. In this way, formally correct information can be given because subject, verb and object are all correct, but without specifying the context, the precedents, without specifying some details and so on, different things can be understood. It is up to us to verify the conclusions by reconstructing the information without taking any aspect for granted or implied. Let's start from a substantial observation, namely that the reality that surrounds us is always and only characterized by the opposition of 2 opposite aspects. For example, good and bad, big and small, beautiful and ugly, near and far, before and after, and so on. It is an ever-changing reality in which all pairs of opposite aspects are constantly changing. If we refer only to black and white, we can imagine reality as a series of shades of gray. Black or white cannot exist on its own. It's a contradiction. You can't just have white because you would rule out the very existence of black and vice versa. So we have to get used to thinking only in terms of shades of gray that can naturally take on extremely light or dark shades that can be considered practically coincident with the concept of black or white. At least by approximation. That said, any information referring to an action, an aspect that concerns a subject and an object cannot be considered only white or only black, but as a shade of gray, at least very light almost white or very dark almost black. Trying to verify the veracity of the information consists of evaluating the context, because the same shade of gray can appear too light or too dark depending on the circumstances. Very often, however, out of mental laziness, we assume that information is absolutely true on the basis of the trust we want to give to the source, neglecting the details, the implied information that often turns out to be different in reality from the way it has been implied. Subject, verb, object, conclusion. When in reality, starting from the subject and the action, several intermediate logical steps had to be observed, various shades of gray that led to a different conclusion. Concluding. Communication is the way we transfer information we have to others, so that others are also informed. Verbal communication is the oldest form of man. This was followed by writing. Electronics with the ability to memorize voice and writing did the rest, and today with the ability of computers to translate voice into writing and to translate words into various languages, we have a machine that behaves in a similar way to humans, giving the impression of being a thinking machine. What we don't realize are 2 important aspects. The first is speech. Without realizing it, we communicate with words, in the form subject, verb, object, effectively transferring a model of reality. A model is a simplification. A model that for the listener consists of a much broader and more complex concept than the simple meaning of the 3-word subject, verb, object, thanks to the fact that various aspects are implicit things. You talk about something to someone who knows what we're talking about. This means that it is able to understand the meaning of our 3 words by adding a wide range of other contextual information, implied, that both the speaker and the listener take for granted. The second is that without realizing it, our speeches, as sets of words, verbs, subjects, objects, end up becoming sentences already said, already written, so that if we hear them uttered by a computer, we have the impression that they are the result of intelligence and not the repetition of things already said, already known. The important thing, whatever the source of the speech, is to remain critical. Always ask yourself why things happen and not take a piece of news at face value just because the source is official, authoritative, or even worse because everyone says so. Truths are truths regardless of the source, and the only guarantee is us with our critical sense. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.